Michael, very welcome to the Creative Souls of Clare podcast. You were telling me before we went on air that there have been no eggs today from the Burren farm that you've been setting up. Well, it's not quite a farm, is it? But you do have some recent arrivals there that have been bringing you a steady supply.
This is very true. I have what I would call a very modest small holding, which I suppose you could say thanks to the pandemic, as these things happen, I've had the time and the energy to keep an eye on and sort of foster properly. One of them being a hen coop, which I'm very proud of. And it's the sort of the first animals I've ever taken care of in my life. And they have been delivering eggs on a regular basis, but I was advised that when winter comes and when the light is gone, that they're very light sensitive when it comes to laying eggs and so on. So I was surprised that there was a return to eggs in the last week. And I'm even surprised that we're starting this discussion on this because, 20 years ago, we would have started with the Cuban Revolution, but now we're on the egg production in the Burren.
The egg revolution, I love it. Yeah, well, have we just therefore captured your whole life journey in one sentence there? The Cuban.
We're done, Rory. I think we're done. We can wrap up.
Wow, there's so much to unpack there. I'll start actually just on the note that I was in Ennistimon this morning, and I was taking a walk by Banner Books, and obviously we're in lockdown as we're recording, so shops are closed, but I actually did see your book in the window display, your newest book, Coming Home to Irish, and it was lovely to see it still in prominence. Are you aware that it's still out there, and or where is
well, I am, and what this is, it's in a sense one of the dilemmas that I've had is that my area of the closest thing you could call expertise in my life has been Latin American revolutionary movements, and that is a fairly small catchment area in the Burren and the west of Ireland. So the books I've produced have been produced by publishers generally elsewhere to an audience that's often elsewhere. So producing that book with Gill, one of the main Irish publishers, meant that for the first time I was seeing my book in every bookshop around the country. And I was actually still, funny you should talk about yesterday, I was in just online yesterday, someone who I contacted for a completely different reason mentioned that they'd read my book. So it's kind of interesting to bring the focus to something much nearer to home in terms of the way it comes back to you.
So I suppose, Michael, that's one of the interesting things about any kind of creative work that you might put out into the world is that it goes off on its own journey and adventure, and that we hear back from people when we hear back, and perhaps sometimes it's years later. Has that been an experience for you with past books and past projects?
Very much so, and sometimes it's actually sort of added to the original project. So particularly in the case of an open-ended book, such as I wrote a biography of Rodolfo Walsh, and it is effectively the first biography published about this man who was a very significant journalist and revolutionary in Argentina and to some extent in Cuba in the 1950s, 60s and 70s. And I wrote the book at a time when Argentina was still emerging from that era and is still emerging with the limitations and the freedoms opening up at the same time, the limits and being tested. And there were a lot of people alive who knew him very well, including his relatives. Two brothers I spoke to before they died. Of course, since then, an awful lot of the people I spoke to have died, which makes a book unique in that that's the end of their testimony. But new people kept coming in who perhaps got a bit more courage as years went by to actually speak. And so you would be surprised when I went back to Cuba, for example, I met somebody who went to their drawer. This is somebody who would have been a lowly journalist in the Cuban press agency who happened to be on duty when Rodolfo was working. Rodolfo worked there for a time. And he went to his drawer and pulled out these photos that had nothing written on them. They're just photos that included Rodolfo and himself. And there were 3 or 4 or 5 of them. And it was amazing that you could still be discovering photos, people, eyewitness stuff that relates to someone like in that, you know, you've written the book, you've really scoured, you've done the detective work, and yet 15 years later you still meet people who have something new to add to a story. So a sense of story is never finished, and that would very much go for the Irish language book that I wrote, because in a sense the book itself is one thing, but the book then gives life to something else. In other words, arising from the book, people began to contact me about their own experiences with the Irish language. And what has been, there are two particular cases which are particularly gratifying. One, a young woman in Germany, a teenager, who wrote to me in Irish, an email in Irish, explaining that she was on a trip to Ireland with her mother, and that they're big book buyers, and they saw my book, bought it, her mother bought it, gave it to her, and she decided she was going to learn Irish. This is a young woman called Laura Weinert, who lives in a small town in Germany. She has been writing to me in Irish consistently for the past 2 years, and about a year and a half ago announced she was coming over with her mother to visit Ireland and wanted to come meet me. So on an afternoon, we had tea and biscuits with Laura, who spoke Irish to me. Her mother was raised learned Russian as a kid. She'd no English whatsoever. And then her sister, who had no English or Irish, her younger sister. So it was a really interesting conversation in which the only common language was Irish, with these three German people, well, between the two of us at least, who had the Irish. Quite remarkable. And then the other example I'd give is a young guy in Blanchardstown who wrote me a letter out of the blue, who just said that he'd read the book and that he'd, you know, like myself, he'd been thinking about Irish, but that he gave him a kick sa hoen, as he said, a kick up the bum, to actually go out and learn it. And he joined the Gael Oak, which is sort of a local GA team that does their stuff through Irish. And that's been another regular pen pal, effectively. So, you know, books are great. They're like seeds and roots. They grow, they keep growing, and they keep moving on. It's a lovely thing.
They're only the stories that you know about, Michael. So presumably, like many thousands of people have read your books, and, you know, you'll only ever hear from a handful of those, or a relative handful. And so for every story that you hear back, there are countless stories that you'll never hear about. And it's almost this magical, mysterious universe that's continues on. The story keeps unfolding, doesn't it?
It does indeed, and that's why I don't. What people get very caught up in sort of, you know, how many books can you sell, how many, you know, what can you do, but everything moves out. You know, it's like public talks. You know, you have 10 people at a talk, or you might have 200, but the one at which you had 10 people might actually prove the more effective in terms of, say, organizing or campaigning, rather than the 200, because maybe something more profound happens at that small gathering with 10 people. I've certainly found that in terms of campaigning.
Yeah,
you know.
No, I would share that view, absolutely. So I'm doing a series of online events at the moment, and, you know, some of them there could be 40, 50, and then some of them maybe more 20. And I try not to get in any way interested in the numbers, because at the end of the day, they're individual lives and stories, and you just don't know the impact that anyone's going to have, me on them or them on me. So it's I suppose that's a human experience, isn't it? That we have to kind of boil things down to its simplest, and sometimes not get too lost in the abstraction of the bigness. There seems to be an obsession with bigness, isn't there?
Isn't there? Yeah, it's like, I remember in Argentina, there's all sorts of campaigns going on, but this group of intellectuals, I don't mean to beat on the intellectuals, they're very necessary in society, but they got together and their campaign was end the external debt. And so they would meet once a week to end the external debt. But the goal is so huge, the ambition is so distant, that over time the fatigue is inevitable. Whereas if it had been, say, to start a small workshop in a community of, you know, sharing experiences about something small, that might have a very different impact, perhaps.
Yeah, absolutely. So Michael, where did this journey in writing and communication in particular start for you? Like, were there early inclinations when you were a child or a teenager perhaps, or was it later on that it emerged?
I think there's a couple of things I'd point to. One of them being a love of reading from a very young age, and reading very broadly through a library of whatever was at hand, and music. Now, I've just been told that this internet connection is unstable. Should I keep going? Or sorry, Roy, I shouldn't have
Well,
stopped there,
the
actually,
world
but
is unstable at the moment, so we'll
okay,
trust
we'll
that
keep going.
there's a strength in
So
instability.
great. So punk rock is the other thing. Music, and not even just punk rock, but before, during, and after punk rock, music came to shape my sort of take on the world, and in that way, punk offered this: anything is possible. You can do it yourself, and you don't have to have some sort of professional knowledge in order to take a crack at something. So I guess for me, the really formative influences, as to the best of which I can remember, and I think one of the great sort of influences we maybe take too much for granted, is what's going on in your family. The family dynamics form such a core part of who you are, what your levels of well-being and confidence are, but you have to set that to one side in a sense, because every family has its own huge dynamic which is impossible to measure or whatever. I would say that reading, an early passion for reading and learning, a passion for soccer, a very physical passion of wanting to be out all the time, kicking a ball around and running around in the cold and the rain and the wet, whatever it was, it didn't bother me. And then music from a very early age. I bought my first single at the age of 8. And I then, over the years, moved into punk rock. And that was enormous, because it was regarded as almost like a revolutionary, even though it wasn't a revolution. There was something revolutionary about it, a massive break with the past, with music, with the way in which music was made, who could make music, levels of, if you're not a professional musician, you can and can't do certain things. You could have a fanzine, you could organize a gig, you could play an instrument badly or well, you could compose songs, and maybe even get to record a demo and an album, and so on and so forth. It completely broke down the barriers of the possible. And I guess I was lucky, and that's an element of privilege that comes with being middle class and being based in Dublin in the 1970s. It gave me a huge confidence in being able to follow my own path. And that led me directly from music through the Clash to the Nicaraguan Revolution via the Sandinista album. If you wanted to pin it down to one album, you would have to stop there. And that then led to, I think a lot of us who campaign on issues. We look at, say, educational reform, maybe look at prison and police reform, maybe look at healthcare, etc. I landed at the age of 21 in a fully scaled revolution in which everything was on the table. In other words, the old order collapsed, and a new set of institutions and ideas and visions were implemented, which meant that everybody was going around making this new society that we couldn't even dream of, in a sense, because our own horizons were so limited by the sort of theocratic stranglehold and the status quo and the political parties and the weather.
Oh, you're including the weather in the mix in there. That's interesting.
I can't help thinking it. Every time I go to a rally in Nicaragua, Mexico, and you plan something, say you plan a 3-day festival of resistance to all the oppressing awfuls that surround you. And you know what? You're going to be able to get out there in a t-shirt and shorts and flip-flops. And almost to a certain extent, you're going to be able to rely on having a dry weather, warm weather, and a kind of a festival vibe. Sorry, that's how it is.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting dynamic. I mean, so, traditionally we like to, and sometimes like to kind of play victim to the role of the British colonialism or the Catholic Church or the Roman Empire or whatever it is, but the weather certainly is not one that we can really blame anybody on as such. So it introduces another dynamic. But if we go back just briefly, Michael, to, you mentioned a first single at the age of eight, I think. I'm just curious what that single was. Do you
I was
remember?
really hoping you wouldn't ask me that, believe me.
Ah, it's Kylie Minogue or something, was it?
Oh,
Not
forward. Kylie Minogue, you're showing your age. It was
okay.
Gary
It
Glitter.
was Madonna. It was Madonna.
Gary Glitter.
Okay, we'll move along now. Uh, well, I think one of my first albums was Shakin' Stevens. So
Oh dear.
I
Okay.
know, I know. Look at whatever it takes, and all music has its value, I suppose. Um, so Michael, what age were you when you first ended up in Latin America?
It would have been going directly to Nicaragua. It was my first time out of Europe. 1985. I was 21 years of age, and it was year 6 of the revolution in Nicaragua. I arrived by boat. I left Dunleary on a boat. I had a farewell that was like a wake. Everybody was there. My first Spanish teacher was there. My parents were there. My girlfriend was there. It was my brother and sisters were there. It's when you think now of the ease with which we,
Yeah, yeah.
pandemic aside, travel, it was a remarkable farewell. And a red and black flag was waved from the shore as the boat departed. You know, that's how kind of exotic and exciting and vital that type of travel was back then, particularly to a place as unusual as Nicaragua with such a radical process going on.
So the fact that you had a red and black, essentially anarchist flag flying, and a sense of on the way to a revolution, did that? I mean, that suggests that there was a kind of a missionary type mission that you were on, and that people were aware of. Like, was it that you were going to offer witness, or were you going to join the revolution? What was the intention?
That's a good question. And in a sense, that's the question that pursued me for the next decade. And I guess everything. It was definitely, I hate the word mission, obviously, for obvious reasons, but it was certainly, in my head, it was a glorious journey of pursuit of an ideal which I would then, given how hard it was to travel, in a sense, I was almost like being entrusted as a delegate to go off, witness, and come back. And that may be why one of the things I did when I came back was organize an exhibition, which, when I think about it now, you know, it was the I was going to say it's the Project Arts Centre. It wasn't the Project Arts Centre. It was in Temple Bar anyway. It was possibly not the Hirschfeld Centre. Anyway, it was one of those buildings that were in the hands of creatives at the time. And I put together an exhibition of posters, recordings, information, and I named it after a Husker Du album called New Day Rising. You know, again, very fanciful and very, in a sense, we can now look at it as you know, you could easily call it naive, but something I was very proud of. There was also a dance piece in it. It was an attempt to translate and bring back some of what I'd seen there. And my very brave Spanish teacher from school brought a class in from this very well-heeled private school in Dublin 4 on Aylesbury Road, and was subsequently summoned to the principal's office by an irate parent who wanted to know why her children were taken to this communist exhibition.
And is that essentially the first inroads into kind of the journey of journalism, in a sense?
It was, because up until then, I was at college then in Trinity, and I had written the odd piece for the college journals and the odd gig review. I was very connected to the music scene. I worked as entertainment officer, organizing the gigs in Trinity just before I went to Nicaragua. That's what gave me the funds to be able to go. And Hot Press agreed to publish a feature of mine about the Nicaraguan Revolution, which was published in 1985, for which I was paid, I recall, £184. I could probably have bought the acre of land I'm sitting on if I'd known, with that money. And that, you know, again, maybe that was a little too easy. I thought, okay, that I did that. I could do that again on a bigger scale, maybe in the future. So it was a very nice introduction to that. And what I suppose happened then, I reread that article last year for the first time since 1985. And I kind of had my head in my hands wondering what sort of glories I'd written about. And I was actually really pleased and surprised with what I'd written then. I believe it stood up within the limitations of writing in the 1980s about
the other thing that
surprising.
stands out for me there, Michael, is the fact that you were, relatively well paid for your work and your labor, which really in the modern context wouldn't necessarily be the case, particularly for a younger person. Like, the media landscape has changed. There's so much more diversity, of course, in opportunity, but the ability to get paid is a whole nother thing. And I wonder how that maybe has undermined journalism as well.
It's quite shocking, I guess, because I would have simply so I began my writing career, if you want to call it that, I would say in 1989, in that's when I became a full-time journalist. And I followed that through into the 2000s and more or less up until the last year or two. And it's been remarkable to see how what you're talking about, that process of people simply not being paid and not expecting to be paid, and how that creates a kind of a mental picture in people's minds. So I've three wonderful nephews, and they all studied journalism in DCU. And one of them has subsequently gone on to become quite a successful journalist in his own right. But watching them negotiate and navigate and talk to me about how they were starting out compared to how I started out is just unbelievable. When I started out, you needed an NUJ card. You needed an NUJ card because the Union of Journalists had an important role to play in ensuring that journalism had standards, had duties and responsibilities. In other words, the journalists got paid, but the journalists also had a code of ethics, which were quite strict, and you would be brought up very quickly on those standards if they were breached. Obviously, there are all sorts of different journalisms going on, tabloid and broadsheet, but it was certainly a craft and an industry that demanded standards, and a sort of an apprenticeship of it. You didn't just walk in off the street and start writing features. You learned a lot about all the different areas of the newspaper structure and operation. That then became anyone can write and publish, which is very good. In the same way, anyone can make music, but the potential for a race to the bottom is obvious. And in the type of country we live in, with the economic structures we live in, that then became very easily a form of exploitation. And that remains, that process is accelerating, and the mainstream media is losing ground, which is not to say that the mainstream media is a martyr necessarily. It's just to say that as a kind of a pillar, it's one of the only sort of pillars which could be held to standards.
Yeah, and I mean, it's additionally relevant as we speak, when we have essentially attempted coup going on in Washington, and the political consequences of this around the world, in terms of not just fake news, but undermining democracy, undermining public health. There's a whole kind of gambit of problems that come with the dismantling of a standard.
Exactly, and so journalism is one end of this, but it happens to be a particularly important one, because what as it's so obvious that what people absorb in information begins to shape their view of the world. Language is so critical, and the shaping of that world becomes the vocabulary and the possibilities of discussion, the spectrum of discussion, and that has really taken a jolt in the past, you could say 5 years, 10 years, 1 year. It seems to become more extreme as we go on, and that makes our discussions and our debates and our political environment much more difficult, much more incoherent, and difficult to kind of come together on.
Mm. That's for sure. Michael, I want to go back to the books and the writing. You know, how many books have you under your belt at this point?
Let me see. I have 4 published books and 1 book that is unpublished.
Okay. So, you know, that's a lot of hours and a lot of craft and a lot of patience and discipline and focus. Can you talk to me a little bit about your practice and what it is for you to, you know, where the idea might come from to getting the bum on the seat and then what follows? Do you have a particular process or discipline, or does it vary from book to book?
I'd say it varies from book to book in terms of how much the balance between research and out in the field interviews versus what I can do myself without leaving a desk. In terms of establishing a practice, I think my time in Latin America was very helpful in that moving from Ireland to South America to work meant a huge shift in my mindset about how things get done, when they get done, and how hard it is to get, say, an interview. So there's an awful lot of walking, waiting, inhospitable conditions, challenges, dangers involved in getting your story in Latin America. And so that set me up with the stamina. I consider it a kind of a work stamina that I have, that I can actually sit down to something and be prepared not to get up before it's done. Whether that's a 1-day thing or 100-day. I think of books often as 100-day wars, battles, in which you do a lot of research. The research time has to be loose because you have to allow yourself the time to waste and wander where things might not work out. And in the case of the Irish book, I think I did 45 interviews. And when I say interviews, most of them were like this. They were sit-down interviews that could have lasted an hour or 2 or more. And they usually involved me traveling somewhere, setting up, reading before I got to the person. In other words, you go and speak to Padre Riada in Clare, or you go up to interview the principal of an Irish school in Derry or Belfast, and you do your homework. And so there's this expanding work demand, research hours that go into a short interview, which then has to be distilled and woven into a narrative that will be accessible and interesting to a wider audience, including an audience who maybe don't know anything about Belfast or Cooley. So all those challenges mean that a huge amount of work's taking place away from the computer, and then when you get to the computer, you have to have the patience to follow through these threads that may take a long time to reveal themselves or become in some way coherent.
Yeah, it strikes me that, you know, that many times people are looking for this secret sauce or recipe of how to kind of create something, but it is a case that the journey is so different for everyone, isn't it? That
it is, and that's why there's no one size fits anyone for this. I think what writers must have in common, I think it just stands to reason, it's fairly obvious, is a overwhelming desire to write, and beyond an overwhelming desire to write, an overwhelming desire to actually put that in a format, in some sort of publication, whether it's online or in print. You really have to want it badly to make it happen, you know?
Yeah, that's for sure. And so, Michael, can you, like, we're obviously going to have to skip entire decades here because we will never get to cover all the different adventures, and hopefully there'll be a book about that people can read in due course. But I want to, we may return to Latin America, but I want to kind of bring us into the Burren and into Clare and how this part of the world has entered your life journey? How did that happen rather?
Again, a series of fortunate events and a total surprise. If somebody had shown me the burn and said, this is where you're going to actually put down roots and establish your permanent pensionable home for the foreseeable, I would have doubted it, if not opposed it. I wasn't taken by the burn at all. It was a chance set of events in which I met someone who moved to the burn. I moved with them, and subsequently they left. I stayed, but it was more or less for the first few years, 2003, say to 2008, it was more like a headquarters where it was really nice to have a place. I never thought I'd own, for a start. Like, land is one of the main issues of contention in Latin America still today, is land ownership. Who owns land and who controls land determines how communities can survive or otherwise, whether that's Mexico or Argentina or wherever. And in that context, I would have spent an awful lot of time focused on land issues. And so owning land, it wasn't on my radar, but it's just so happened that it was own land or nothing. This acre came up and it was either buy it or don't have it. It wasn't for rent. And I was starting to be in a position where I needed to rent because I was spending more time in Ireland. Arising from all that, this place fell into my hands rather than me. I never went looking for it. It sort of came looking for me, landed in my lap to some extent. But I can tell you that from 2003 in March, when I arrived here, until March 2020, there was a fraction of the work done compared to the last year. In other words, last year I actually settled here. Before that, it was like a headquarters, and I came and went and liked it and enjoyed it. More and more I began to see the burn and get to know the burn and love the sky and the mountains. Sliabh Rua, Mullaghmore, all those places, really special places and a great community. But I only really found myself in here since March, and that coincides with having a small child. I have a 2-year-old boy, Fela, who, again, through him discovering the burn, which is like his big natural playground, I'm rediscovering the burn at his pace. And that pace is very slow and very reflective and very dreamy. And so this acre has suddenly become a universe of possibility, from seeds to hens to polytunnel to picnic areas to swing and slide and so on. And it's as if, whereas before I thought that I needed to sweep across the world, it seems now like I feel the need to dig down where I am. And that's a lovely feeling. As you get a little older, it seems to dovetail very nicely into where your energy is and the balance in your life is, I think.
So does that suggest also that perhaps you're finding more peace in yourself?
Absolutely. And it's not the burn alone, but the burn certainly helps. It's not Fela alone, but Fela certainly helps. It's also a process of, I suppose, just delving into spirituality. So I would have been raised in an atmosphere where a word like spirituality was linked to the Catholic Church, and it was fairly meaningless. It was empty, and rebellion at that time, the punk rebellion and others, was targeting that, and that was seen as a kind of an orthodoxy and a status quo to be challenged. Then when you slip that coat off or that skin off and you have a chance to go out into the world yourself, spirituality, which is this very very difficult to pin down but very, very easy to recognize when it meets you, whether that's the Camino. I did the Camino journey with my niece, and that was, I guess I'd have to call that a spiritual experience, even though we simply walked and talked, But I began reading, Osho, big influence, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century. And then visiting India and going to an ashram, spending time in meditation, totally opened up this idea that we are not simply political beings. We're not simply anything. We're interconnected in all ways, and that we are energy. And again, those concepts sound terribly flimsy to when you spend a life or a good portion of your life in pursuit of very concrete revolutionary change, but they come at you and they cannot be ignored. And if you let them in, there's a transformation that's very beautiful, and that brings a peace which doesn't exclude any other aspect of your life. It simply adds this amazing extra awareness to how you go about your life.
Yeah, I suppose they're not mutually exclusive, you know, the realm of social change and personal change, that there is an interface, there is an interconnectedness. And I wonder sometimes, you know, the left in particular traditionally would have an aversion to organized religion, or at least the role of organized religion and this in respect with the state, and quite rightly so, for many reasons. But do you think there's sometimes a throwing the baby out with the bathwater?
I think it's more a case of looking at where power lies in society, and also the right of doubt and uncertainty to present itself in every area we work in, whether that's campaigning, whether that's parenting, whether that's work. There is a fear in the left of uncertainty. We like to have documents and manifests that tell us where we're going. We like to have the steps to revolution. We like to have the certainties, because uncertainty is seen as a threat to some sort of collective organizing effort. Uncertainty, whether that's, you know, allowing even just something, something that really struck me, say, the dehumanization of the people who are not on your side. There is a almost unconscious but yet deliberate way in which we sort of look on our opponents as different, as different in some essential area as ourselves, whereas spirituality won't allow you that luxury. That's a luxury, because that luxury then says that person is over there, I'm here, they're wrong, I'm right. And that's the nice certainty that allows us to proceed and say, okay, we did this and that wasn't too good, but we did it because we had to, because they're the bad, they're the people we have to overcome. Spirituality invites and demands a higher threshold and a more generous approach, which has a cost to it. The cost being that we can no longer rely on certainty, and we can no longer throw doubt under the carpet. We actually have it in front of us and say, you know, here we are doing this, but you know, those people over there are doing their thing, and they're not necessarily bad people, and perhaps I could be them and they could be me. You know, again, this all gets to sound quite insubstantial, but when you're actually to bring forward something that holds those principles, actually is a very exciting leap into the unknown, which I believe could have very, very positive consequences for those trying to create a more just society.
Do you think that that would bring us to a more Zapatista sensibility? Do you think that La Mystica and that whole notion of the magical possibilitarian world, is that something that the Zapatistas do well in your view, or?
Yeah, you know, what I think the Zapatistas bring together, and I guess sort of my own evolution has gone from sort of Sandinista to Zapatismo. Sandinista, if you'll allow a little bit of intellectual jargon here, there's hegemony. There's a hegemonic project which says that this movement is taking charge of a process, and that if you must believe and trust us, and what we say and what we demand must be the way forward, because it's the only way, because we know. And that's very tempting because in a sense, as in Cuba, it allows you to join a project without doubts and uncertainty. However, the limits of that have been seen in Cuba. They've been seen in Nicaragua in a very sad way. The return of Ortega as a kind of a neoliberal, ultra-Catholic, exclusive ultra-Catholic autocrat. And then you meet the Zapatistas, where you find a movement prepared to say, we don't have all the answers, but a movement that is rooted in a community life, some of it quite conservative, because it says, this group of rebels, urban rebels, moved to the southeast because nowhere was safe from the state in the capital. The massacres were being carried out. So these people went underground and found themselves in a community that they thought they were going to teach revolution to. They ended up being swallowed up by that community and its own values, which are based on what they call the mandar obedeciendo, which is a very fanciful notion that power is at the service of community rather than the other way around. And they've done their best to follow those principles by declaring autonomy and saying, we are all the government. And we are all the government is an incredibly unwieldy social project, which sees literally every month a transfer of government in a community or in a region from 20 people from one region to 20 people in another. So you are the ministries and the government literally for 30 or 60 days at a time. So partly it's chaos, and partly it functions because it's only trying to establish a project in a small area in which people speak Celtal, grow food, go out to the milpa. Everybody does almost the same job. Everybody in the community, almost every last person does the same thing, and belongs to a small number of families that are interconnected. So it can work on that scale. So it's not that the Zapatismo can be applied mechanically to somewhere else. It's that the values and the way they've gone has proven a reasonable compromise between the possible and the desirable.
Do you think that the dream has held out? I mean, it's been over 20 years now since it's kind of perhaps the pinnacle or the heyday of the at least the global influence of the Zapatistas. I'm wondering, if we look in now, what do you think the health of that dream is?
And on the 20th anniversary, which is 2014, 2015, and the state was doing its best to try and show statistically that the Zapatista communities were poorer than the communities that were not Zapatista. And it was very interesting because they had this measuring scale, which was all about economic factors. So these communities in the Zapatista territory didn't accept state aid because part of the autonomy project was to sort of channel independent aid from NGOs where possible and just build an alternative that's low cost, low maintenance, and does not rely on the state, because the state giveth and the state taketh away, and you're ultimately hostage to a political party or whatever. The Zapatistas then brought out their own measuring, to some extent, of the last 20 years. And the issue is, it involves principles like dignity, independence, a indigenous education sector. In other words, the state sent in bilingual teachers. Just a small example. The state's plan was, everybody needs to speak Spanish. You're Mexican. So we give you these teachers that will ultimately teach all your kids to speak Spanish well so they can function well in the market economy. The Zapatistas had a different idea, and they developed their own instructors in their own communities and their own schools. And that's gone reasonably well in the circumstances, so that you actually have this sense of an autochthonous, as they call it, not just autonomy, but autochthony, which is kind of about the restoration and putting the indigenous life at the center of an indigenous community, rather than it being something that has to be ultimately done away with and assimilated into a greater project that is Mexico. So it's a lot of what has been achieved by the Zapatistas are intangibles. What I would say is that if you look back, if you were to take a measuring rod to the Mexican state in the last 20 years, you would find, 150,000 people killed in the so-called drug wars. You would find 25,000 people disappeared, totally unaccounted for. These were in the communities that have the stamp of approval of the Mexican state. Those people frequently come and go from the states to work to make up the shortfall in their money. Those people are dying and disappearing on the way to the states, but they don't count in the statistics. Just like the massive human cost of the drug war. Like my friends having lived in Mexico for 8 years, I have a lot of friends in Mexico City and elsewhere, not just in Chiapas, and those people have been almost, to use a terrible phrase, decommissioned in the last 10 years. They are now almost confined to home. There's almost an invisible curfew because fear, the fear is so great. If you're a woman or if you're a young man of an age that the cartel might be attracted or might find you useful, it's psychologically it's a state of terror for an awful lot of people. So how do you measure that on the economic scale? And the Zapatista territory, by maintaining this stubborn resilience, has kept the cartels at bay. You can't operate a cartel in a Zapatista community. You can't. It's not easy to penetrate the Zapatista territory because it's a territory that's under. It's not on. The Zapatistas' military strength is tiny. It's symbolic, but their unity, where it holds, is a clear buffer to what's happening in the rest of Mexico. And I've never seen, in terms of a country going downhill, you would have to compare it to dictatorships. So in Argentina, if you were in Argentina in 1973 and you were in Argentina in 1976, you damn well notice the difference within, an hour of arriving. You'd see the tanks and the police and the patrols and the searches and the this, that, and the other, and the fear. In Mexico, you could, democracy, so-called democracy, has not been interrupted. But people's lives are massively interrupted and disrupted and limited by what's going on there. So where does all that fit into the scale of human development,
Yeah.
So that's a long answer to what you asked.
Yeah, there's a lot there, Michael. One other aspect I'm curious about is that, having seen life from a global lens, if you like, to have your own piece of heaven at your doorstep there, and with your acre and your vegetables and your child and the mountains, and I'm just wondering, does it give you a newfound sense of gratitude and perspective to just kind of cherish that? Because I suppose I'm projecting my own sense somewhat, whereby we sometimes we're overly and sometimes rightfully complaining about how bad things are in Ireland, or what we don't have or what we do wrong. But do you have that sense of perspective, I suppose?
Yeah, I call it the GG factor, Rory.
What factor?
I have gone from guilt. The GG factor.
Oh, it has a name.
It has a name, of course. It's gonna get big. Don't worry. From guilt, I guess, to gratitude. So there was definitely a point when things settled here that I felt. I used to wake up every morning, and I know before I had breakfast, I was reminded in my head that I'm white, male, middle class, and enjoying an unearned privilege in this field.
Yeah, and did you go out and flog yourself with a whip then?
I did. Well, I got a neighbor to do that, but we don't talk about that. That then transformed. I guess this is where the spiritual comes in, if that doesn't sound like sort of an easy excuse. But having a child, then it went to being more about gratitude and about accepting that there are so many circumstances not of your own making and that affect your life and bring you to somewhere. But it has certainly given me a sense in which I feel responsible every hour of every day to try and be a better human being, however dim and distant that sounds, and so on. It means that interacting with a neighbor, interacting with anyone, with an animal, with a plant, with a tree, it gratitude is now in my mind. It's on the tip of my tongue rather than somewhere buried back as a kind of a cliche. Oh, I know I come from this background in Dublin, so I must always remember that. Now it's actually like a living function of how I operate. That's a big difference for me. I hope I can live that out, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it sounds like a good note to end on, you know, just that sense of the journey and coming to that sense of peace, because I suppose like that's really what we're all seeking one way or the other, whether you're whatever color, gender, religion, race, income stream, whatever it is, like some sense of peace. You know, obviously there's a spectrum in there too, and it's not everybody perhaps is signed up exactly the same way, but there, you know, your last book there, Coming Home to Irish, there, it feels to me that, you know, there's part of that, or maybe it's the sequel, is just coming home, really coming home to oneself.
Absolutely. And I think if there's a next book, which I hope there will be because I'm tipping away at it, it will be precisely that. It rather than being about, say, a single language or a single journey, it's a reconciling of all the elements of the jigsaw, the strange jigsaw puzzle and the mystery, and trying to not necessarily make sense, because making sense means that you're starting to put them into little boxes and say this fits here, there, and everywhere. Nothing really fits, but saying that actually this is okay. You know, the what you do and where you are and how you end up is we're fine. You know, and doing your best, doing that little bit each day, whatever it means.
Lovely.
I guess.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast, Michael. Thanks for your time, and look forward to reading that next book when it's ready.